Nate Diaz versus Jorge Masvidal. 2019 was already a fairy tale year for Jorge Masvidal. He iced Darren Till in London, scored the fastest knockout in UFC history with the 5-second knee to Ben Askren, and had just baptized Nate Diaz on the microphone in the build-up to UFC 244. Diaz had returned from a 3-year layoff to beat Anthony Pettis, called out Masvidal, and then gifted us the phrase, baddest mother in the game. The UFC, never one to turn down a new belt idea, actually made one. A one-off title, the BMF belt, complete with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson on hand to present it. Even the President of the United States showed up at Madison Square Garden. For the UFC, this was about as close to a WrestleMania moment as they'd ever produced. The fight itself started well enough for Masvidal. He dropped Diaz with a head kick in the first, opened up an old scar over Nate's eye, and spent the next 2 rounds dealing out steady punishment. Diaz, being Diaz, kept walking forward, bleeding everywhere, refusing to fold. The Garden crowd was eating it up, waiting for the late round comeback. That's what Nate does. But after round 3, the cage-side doctor had other plans. He took one look at Nate's cut and waved it off. The fight was over, just like that. No round 4, no Diaz rally, no closure. Masvidal got the belt, the crowd booed mercilessly, and The Rock looked about as thrilled as someone forced to give a world's best dad mug to a stepfather they hate. Sure, Masvidal was winning handily, and odds are the fight wasn't turning around, but that's not what the night was supposed to be. The fans didn't show up to watch a doctor stop a bloody Diaz. They showed up for chaos, for violence, for 5 rounds of mayhem. Instead, they got the MMA equivalent of an unplugged arcade machine. Disappointment mixed with refund requests. The UFC had hyped this thing to the moon, only to have it collapse under the most anticlimactic ending possible. Fans left MSG before the interviews even started. On paper, Masvidal became the first and only BMF champion. In reality, the only thing anyone remembered was that this fight, set up to crown the baddest man alive, was stopped by a guy with a stethoscope. Anderson Silva versus Damian Maia. When the government of Abu Dhabi bought a piece of the UFC in 2009, the promotion decided to throw them a welcome party, a massive pay-per-view under the desert sun. UFC 112 was stacked. BJ Penn defending his lightweight title against Frankie Edgar, Matt Hughes fighting Renzo Gracie for bragging rights, and headlining it all, the pound-for-pound king Anderson Silva defending his middleweight crown against Damian Maia. On paper, it looked like the perfect international showcase. Then the bell rang. For 5 rounds, Silva put on what can only be described as performance art. He danced, he taunted, he threw bizarre feints, and he mostly refused to engage. The first round looked like a warm-up. The second, like an audition tape for interpretive dance. By the third, Silva had Maia bloody, but was more interested in mocking him than finishing. The crowd turned fast, booing, chanting. Even Anderson's own corner looked confused. And then came Dana White's breaking point. The president of the UFC, the man who had just sold Abu Dhabi on how unstoppable and entertaining his star champion was, walked out of the arena mid-fight. When the final horn sounded, Anderson still won a wide unanimous decision, but instead of Dana wrapping the belt around his waist, he had Silva's manager do it. White later called it one of the most embarrassing nights of his career, and the numbers back that up. Despite barely throwing punches, Silva managed to bust Maia's face open and still dominate the scorecards. But that wasn't the story. The story was the champion who acted like he didn't want to be there, the fans who felt cheated, and the UFC boss who literally couldn't stomach watching anymore. It was supposed to be a showcase for Abu Dhabi. Instead, it became the fight Dana White swore he'd never rewatch again. Anderson Silva still left with his belt, but what he didn't leave with was his reputation as an untouchable, can't-miss fighter. For many fans, this was the night the aura cracked. Tito Ortiz versus Vladimir Matyushenko. UFC 33 was supposed to be a coronation. The promotion had finally cracked Nevada, the fight capital of the world, and was ready to prove that MMA belonged in the bright lights of Las Vegas. They even named the card Victory in Vegas, just in case the symbolism wasn't obvious. 3 title fights stacked on one main card. Zuffa's first big chance to show what the new UFC was all about, and it bombed. Every single fight on the main card went to a decision. Not one of them was entertaining. By the time the co-main between Jens Pulver and Dennis Hallman limped across the finish line, fans were already checked out. All hopes rested on the main event. Tito Ortiz, the brash light heavyweight champion, taking on Vladimir Matyushenko, the stoic Russian wrestler known as the Janitor. Maybe Tito could save the night. He did not save the night. For 25 minutes, Ortiz out-wrestled Matyushenko in one of the least inspiring title defenses ever. The Janitor spent most of the fight holding on for dear life, and Tito was content to rack up points without ever coming close to finishing. It was dry, it was dull, and worst of all, it was long. Too long. The card dragged so badly that several pay-per-view providers literally cut the broadcast mid-main event because it ran over the scheduled window. Fans who paid for the UFC's Big Vegas debut didn't even get to see the ending, which in hindsight was probably doing them a favor. Dana White has called UFC 33 the worst card in company history more times than anyone can count. It wasn't just that the fights were boring. It wasn't just that the timing was botched. It was that this night was meant to be a milestone. Instead, it became a punchline, a supposed victory that went down as the UFC's first truly public disaster. Jose Aldo versus Aiman Zahabi. Jose Aldo, the featherweight legend, showed up in Montreal with one eye on history. It was billed as possibly his last dance. He was supposed to fight at bantamweight versus Zahabi, but things went sideways early. Aldo failed to hit the bantamweight limit, 136 pounds, and by weigh-in day, they had to shift the fight to featherweight because Aldo was too heavy and the athletic commission wouldn't allow the required weight discrepancy. From round one, Aldo looked like vintage Aldo, sharp striking, hunting Zahabi with knees and kicks. He dropped Zahabi with a head kick in the first. The fight was competitive. Aldo arguably had rounds 1 and 2 clearly in his favor. He was doing damage, making things happen. Then came round 3. Aldo's cardio started to show strain. Zahabi started to find space. He avoided a lot of strikes, defended well, and when Aldo's pace slipped, Zahabi pounced. Takedowns, ground control, elbows, enough activity to sway momentum. When the scorecards came in, all 3 judges gave it 29-28 to Zahabi. Unanimous. Hard to argue that wasn't going to be controversial. Many fans and fighters thought Aldo earned the win. Most media outlets scored at least rounds 1 and 2 for Aldo. After hearing the decision, Aldo removed his gloves and announced what many suspected: this might be it, his final fight. Holm versus Germaine de Randamie. UFC 208 was doomed before the cage door even shut. The card was thin. The promotion hadn't run a pay-per-view in January because they couldn't find a headliner, and now they were asking fans to cough up for an event topped by Holm, coming off 2 straight losses, versus Germaine de Randamie, a talented striker, but hardly a household name. The hook? It was the UFC's first ever women's featherweight title fight. A new division, a new champion, a guaranteed path to Chris Cyborg. At least that was the plan. The fight itself was, to put it politely, not electrifying. Then came the real problem. De Randamie landed punches after the horn at the end of both the second and third rounds. Not little taps either. One of them wobbled home badly. The referee, Todd Anderson, did absolutely nothing. No point deductions, no warnings that mattered. Holm was left shaking her head in disbelief. The fight went to the judges. De Randamie got the unanimous decision, and the Brooklyn crowd let her have it with a chorus of boos. Holm appealed the result with the New York Commission, citing the late blows. The appeal was denied, and it somehow got worse. Instead of building to the obvious money fight with Cyborg, de Randamie flat out refused, citing Cyborg's positive PED test from 5 years earlier. The UFC stripped her of the title, which meant the very first women's featherweight title fight, the one that was supposed to launch a brand new division, effectively didn't matter at all. So to recap, the UFC sold fans on history, delivered a slow fight, allowed unanswered fouls to go unchecked, and then had to erase the whole championship run 2 months later. If there's such a thing as a belt existing in vain, UFC 208 invented it. Magomed Ankalaev versus Cutelaba. There are bad stoppages, and then there's the night Virginia referee Kevin McDonald decided Cutelaba was unconscious while he was very much still throwing punches. This was supposed to be a fun, chaotic light heavyweight scrap. Ankalaev came in as a surging prospect, Cutelaba as a wild man who could either knock you out or get himself knocked out trying. That's the appeal. From the opening bell, Ankalaev let his hands go, and Cutelaba started wobbling around the cage like he'd had a few too many. Except And here's the important part, he was clearly still swinging back. McDonald didn't see it that way. Just 38 seconds into the fight, he jumped in and waved it off. Ankalaev got his hand raised. Cutelaba went ballistic, screaming at the officials, physically pushing Ankalaev away, looking like a man who'd just been robbed on live television. Fans on social media called it one of the worst stoppages in UFC history. Even Dana White admitted the referee absolutely blew it. Cutelaba appealed to the Virginia Commission to overturn the result, but they denied him. The UFC booked a rematch. Then the pandemic hit. The fight was postponed 3 separate times before finally happening 7 months later, when Ankalaev knocked Cutelaba out clean in the first round. By then, the damage to credibility was already done. Instead of a firefight, the UFC had to sit through months of memes about the Cutelaba dive and another commission dragged under the bus. When a stoppage is so bad that even the winner looks uncomfortable, you know it's made the wrong kind of history. Pat Miletich versus Andre Pederneiras. A UFC title fight is supposed to mean something. Champion versus top contender, elite against elite. But back in 1999, the promotion still had a habit of booking matchups that looked more like favors than legitimate defenses. And nowhere was that clearer than Pat Miletich's welterweight title defense at UFC 21. Miletich was in his prime, already a veteran of nearly 30 professional fights. His opponent, Andre Pederneiras, a 1-0 pro, not 10-0, not undefeated on the regional scene. One win, a single victory against Rumina Sato in Vale Tudo, Japan, almost a year earlier. That's it. The UFC didn't even bother to hype him up. The pre-fight video package barely mentioned him, and during his walkout, the commentary team's big selling line was, "Here comes a young man from Brazil." That was the entire introduction. Not exactly the stuff of blockbuster marketing. The fight itself went about how you'd expect. Pederneiras had world-class jiu-jitsu credentials, but against a seasoned pro like Miletich, it didn't matter. He mounted zero offense. After a round and a half of being shut down, Miletich opened up a cut over his eye, and the doctor stopped it. Title defense over. Crowd unimpressed. Legacy unaffected. In hindsight, the matchup feels like something the UFC would rather pretend never happened. A 1-0 challenger in only the 4th welterweight title fight in history. That's not building a division. That's undermining it. Today, Pederneiras is respected as the founder of Nova União, the gym that produced champions like Jose Aldo and Renan Barão. But on that night in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, he was just the guy who never should have been in there. Jared Cannonier versus Nassourdine Imavov. Main events are supposed to end decisively. That's the whole point. 5 rounds, big names, a clear winner who moves closer to a title shot. Instead, Cannonier versus Imavov gave us yet another entry and the referee stopped it too early. Hall of Shame. For 3.5 rounds, it was a competitive scrap. Cannonier, the perennial middleweight contender, was pressing forward. Imavov playing sniper. Then in the 4th, Imavov cracked Cannonier with a counter right hand. Cannonier stumbled, retreated to the cage, and looked dazed. But crucially, he was still defending, still moving, still firing back. That's when referee Jason Herzog jumped in and called it. TKO for Imavov at 1:34 of the 4th round. Cannonier, visibly stunned by both the punch and the stoppage, immediately protested. The crowd wasn't thrilled either. Social media lit up with fighters, analysts, and fans calling it premature. Let the man fight became the refrain. The problem wasn't whether Cannonier was hurt. He was. The problem was that he wasn't done. A 40-year-old contender who had fought his way back into relevance was denied even the chance to recover. Instead of clarity, the UFC was left with another middleweight main event ending in controversy. Imavov walked away with the win, but not the kind that makes anyone rush to crown him as the next big thing. Cannonier got his record dinged by what looked like an overeager whistle, and the UFC got a spotlight moment hijacked by yet another debate over what intelligently defending yourself actually means. When your headliner leaves fans angrier at the officiating than invested in the fighters, that's not a main event, it's a meme. Amanda Nunes versus Miesha Tate. If UFC 100 was the company's crowning achievement, then UFC 200 was meant to be its bicentennial sequel. Bigger, louder, and just as historic. The marketing was off the charts. Gold canvas, stacked card, legends everywhere. On paper, it looked bulletproof. In practice, it unraveled into one of the UFC's most awkward birthday parties. Originally, the headliner was going to be Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz II, the most anticipated rematch in company history. Then Conor skipped a press conference and got yanked. No problem. John Jones versus Daniel Cormier II would save the day, except 2 days before the event, Jones popped for a banned substance and was pulled. Suddenly, the biggest card in UFC history was left with a new main event. Miesha Tate defending her bantamweight title against Amanda Nunes. Now, in hindsight, that sounds fine. Nunes is the greatest female fighter of all time, and this was her breakout moment. But in 2016, she wasn't a household name. Tate was fresh off winning the belt from Holm, and the matchup felt more like a come-down than a climax. The fight itself didn't help. Nunes swarmed Tate early, battered her on the feet, took her back, and choked her out in under 4 minutes. It was decisive, but it felt like the entire crowd was still waiting for the real main event that never came. As if that wasn't enough, Brock Lesnar's heavily hyped return against Mark Hunt ended with him grinding out a safe, boring decision and then failing both pre- and post-fight drug tests. The UFC had even waived the usual USADA testing period to make his comeback possible, which made the optics worse. UFC 200 still sold over 1 million pay-per-views, but instead of being remembered as a triumph, it went down as a comedy of errors, scrapped fights, drug failures, and a main event that landed with a thud. Amanda Nunes got her belt, but the UFC got a reminder that no amount of gold paint can cover up bad luck and worse timing. Tito Ortiz versus Ken Shamrock. Sometimes the UFC nails it with rivalries. Sometimes it gets carried away and forgets that the fight still has to deliver. Tito Ortiz versus Ken Shamrock was both. Their first clash at UFC 40 was a landmark event, one of the fights credited with keeping Zuffa afloat in its darkest days. By 2006, both men were coaches on The Ultimate Fighter 3, trading insults and shoving each other on weekly TV. The rematch was inevitable, and it became the selling point of UFC 61. Fans bought in hard. The card did 775,000 pay-per-views, the UFC's biggest number ever at the time. The co-main event was Arlovsky versus Silva third for the heavyweight belt, but make no mistake, people tuned in for Tito and Ken. The UFC marketed it as a grudge match for the ages. What they got was less than that. As soon as the fight began, Tito took Ken down and went to work with his trademark elbows. After just 1 minute and 18 seconds, referee Herb Dean jumped in and stopped it. Shamrock popped up instantly, furious, trying to keep fighting. Fans in the arena erupted with boos and chants of bullshit. Even Ortiz looked more confused than celebratory. The stoppage was widely criticized as premature. Yes, Shamrock was 42, past his prime, and eating hard shots. But it was a grudge match built up for months, and fans wanted blood, not an abrupt referee intervention. The backlash was so strong that Dana White quickly booked a third fight between them on free TV as a way to make amends. That fight, held just 3 months later, ended the exact same way. Ortiz took Ken down and stopped him with elbows in the first round. The only difference was that referee John McCarthy let it go on long enough that nobody could complain. In the end, the trilogy boosted Tito's legacy, gave Shamrock a final paycheck, and helped cement the Ultimate Fighter era. But UFC 61 remains one of those nights where the hype was huge, the sales were record-breaking, and the fight itself was a 78-second letdown, proof that sometimes even your biggest wins can feel like losses.